I was just sort of trying to revise my homework, having had a couple of conversations with people on the way in, and thought, hang on, I've not got this right actually in my head. And we don't, this is the first time actually that we've really sought to address this that I know of at Labour Party conference this year. And it does make you wonder why not, because actually this is the kind of central question for me in my everyday life as the Member of Parliament for Wigan, and it was thrown into sharp relief for me actually during the Brexit vote, when I spent time not just in my own constituency but travelling all over the country, but particularly in those northern towns from Wigan to Bolton to Sunderland to Middlesbrough, talking to people and then eventually stopping and listening to people and starting to wonder, how is it that so often on these major questions we end up on a different side, from lifelong socialists, trade unionists, people who voted Labour for decades, and what does it say about us and what do we need to do? And it culminated for me actually in 2017, a general election that my friend, the academic Rob Ford at Manchester University, described as an election that turned class politics on its head, because what we found after 7 years of austerity was that in those working class towns that had been hardest hit by the cuts, people were increasingly turning right, while in the cities, those who had more and with more opportunities and were optimistic about the future were increasingly turning left. Now that's not to belittle the achievement that says that we win seats in Canterbury, but it says to me that we should be worried that we're losing seats in places like Mansfield and question what's gone wrong. And in fact we'd had years of warnings about this. Before that, in towns like mine, we'd had this dramatic rise in support for UKIP. Before that, we'd had years of falling turnout that we said was apathy because we couldn't hear the roar that lies on the other side of silence. And to understand the roots of this discontent, I think you have to go back quite some way. So you have to look back right across the course of my lifetime to the decline of industry in many towns across Britain, and then a series of choices that were made by successive governments afterwards. The Manchester that I was born into in 1979 was like almost every city in the country. It was older than its surrounding towns. But over the course of the next 4 decades, as that industry disappeared and wasn't replaced in towns, towns have aged dramatically and cities have got much, much younger. And in 2005, Tony Blair came to Labour conference and he said, "The character of this changing world is indifferent to tradition, unforgiving of frailty. The future is replete with opportunities, but they only go to those swift to adapt, slow to complain, open, willing, and able to change." But what of those unable to adapt? Those towns where between a third and half of the working age population had no skills and qualifications at all. Well, I'll tell you what happened. We got the warehouses and the courier delivery jobs and the well-paid jobs, and the investment went into the cities. And that's why dramatically over the course of my lifetime we've seen these demographic shifts, because those kids then that could grasp the opportunities opened up to them by the expansion of higher education left and went to university, often for the first time ever in their family history. But when they looked back, increasingly they found that there was nothing to return home to. And as families have aged, grandparents have got older, they live hundreds of miles away from their children and grandchildren. This is becoming a social crisis. No wonder then that my friend and colleague Jo Cox set up a loneliness commission to look at what was happening in towns like hers and mine across the country. But it's done something else as well as setting families apart and close communities coming undone. It's cost us our working age population and therefore our spending power. So all of these things that you hear Rebecca Long-Bailey and John McDonnell grappling with now, the crisis on our high streets, the loss of community banks and pubs and libraries and bus networks, all of these things can be traced back to a series of choices that we made several decades ago. No wonder then the anger, because these jobs that are left offer neither purpose nor pride nor security nor dignity nor hope. Take Barnsley as an example. When you go to Barnsley, pride in the mining past, just like in Wigan, is absolutely palpable. It is everywhere. You wouldn't find anybody though saying that what they want for their children and their grandchildren is to work down the mines, but you won't find anybody either who says that what they want for their children and grandchildren is to work in ASOS, which is now the major employer in that town, employing young people on minimum wage, 0 hours, zero hope jobs, packing boxes in warehouses. And contrast that with Silicon Valley, where I went when I was the Shadow Energy Secretary, where their federal government has the power to cut taxes for clean energy investment and also to set some of the toughest environmental legislation in the world. And what's that done? That's done is create a market, and it's driven investment into that market. They've attached conditions to those who come and invest. You've got to have apprenticeships, there have to be routes through for local kids to get into that world-leading renewable hub that they've created. So their kids are designing the battery technology of the future, while back home ours are assembling solar panels or packing boxes in ASOS. But why shouldn't young people in Barnsley get the chance to power us through the next generation like their parents and grandparents powered us through the last? And I'll tell you why they don't. It's because the decisions that are made about the fabric of this country are made hundreds of miles away by indifferent officials and politicians who have no skin in the game. And in years of dealing with Whitehall and Westminster from the outside and in, what I've learned is that Whitehall doesn't see potential, it sees only problems. And it will never come close to matching the ambition and the power in these communities themselves. So we have to move political power much closer to home to give us the chance to invest, to create the infrastructure and the fabric that businesses need to invest and get those good quality jobs back into towns. But there's one other thing as well, and it's this, that for Labour to convince people in the towns that will make up the key battleground for the next election that we can be trusted, we have to go back and win back some trust. Because the Brexit vote didn't just expose differences between towns and cities about the EU. Actually, on almost every social measure over the course of my lifetime, cities have become younger and more liberal, and towns have become older and more socially conservative. So social security, immigration, human rights, civil rights, LGBT rights, on all of these questions, views in towns and cities have completely diverged, and too often our response to that has been to lecture and condemn and write off entire communities with their concerns rather than seeking to listen and understand what lies behind them. These are the two Englands that Will Jennings, who co-founded the Centre for Towns with us, described so compellingly in a paper that he wrote just after Brexit. And I think that there's something much more pernicious behind this actually, which is that for those who prioritise rootedness and connectedness and stability, the people who choose to live in or stay in towns, there's been a growing sense over recent decades that not only has mainstream politics failed to comprehend, speak for or respond to the concerns they've raised in recent decades, but is deeply disrespectful towards their lives and their choices. You can see it in the contempt for patriotism that Stephen's written about. You can see it in the attachment to place and the desire for community. Too often, what I hear is that life in towns is stifling, dull, provincial. It was summed up for me by a shadow cabinet minister going out the day after the referendum vote came in to say that anyone who voted Leave was racist. 70% of my town are not racist. And to win back people's trust, you have to begin by acknowledging the difference in lived experience and the concerns that they have. Now, there's a problem here, and I'm going to be really honest about it, is that we're not well placed to deal with this in Labour, because overwhelmingly, over the last decade, we've become much, much more London-centric. And this isn't to write off the contribution that London makes or the very real problems that we have. But consider the NEC, our party membership, our shadow cabinet. It's overwhelmingly dominated by small parts of the country. But then consider this, where we are in power. Not nationally, but in almost every major town and city across this country, Labour is in government. And there is a story to tell about the difference that those councils are making. And that's why I say, don't attack Labour councils, because actually the route to number 10 Downing Street runs right through those towns in which they are the last line of defence for the things that matter most to people and thinking differently. And in the end, I think that is the clue, actually, because the glue that binds these two Englands together in the end, I think, is clear. What unites David Lammy's Tottenham, young, socially liberal, diverse Remain voting, with my Wigan, older, more homogenous Leave voting? It's Labour. For decades, those communities have come out and consistently voted Labour. And we can't take it for granted, because in many of those areas that I've just talked about, we are going backwards in the towns that will determine the key battleground for the next election. But the clue is there, because when I go to those towns, I don't detect any real enthusiasm for the Tories. These are Labour values, and the feeling is not that they've left us, but that we've left them, and we have to respond to it. And what connects them across those towns and cities, the Tottenhams and the Wigans? It's this desire for power and this rejection, a growing sense of rejection about a system in which indifferent officials hundreds of miles away are making decisions which at a stroke of a pen wipe out hopes and dreams for people in places that they'll never meet. And just finally I'll say this, that for me this understanding, this recognition about power is not just crucial to the future of this country. Labour, the only force in my view that can unite a divided Britain, but it's crucial, it's existential to the Labour Party, because in recent years I think we wrongly came to believe that our purpose and mission was about redistribution of wealth, and we forgot that from Keir Hardie to Nye Bevan, our job has always been to fight for equality of power in all its forms. And I think we're starting to remember that again, and I'm glad that we are, because when I look around the landscape in British politics, I see no other political force at the moment that is capable of uniting these two Englands. These are two Englands with different priorities and values, but an equally burning sense of ambition for the country, and Labour must match it.